And he looks at me and just says, he's dead. There's nothing you can do.
This week on High Performance, the heartbreaking, uplifting, inspiring life story of Kenton Cool.
And I just look at this guy, and he's literally, his head is in my lap. 10 years on, I still struggle with this. And Dorji just says, we got to climb. Dorji, we can't climb. And he just looks at me and goes, we should climb. And we're not climbing for him, we're climbing for me. And he knows me so well. And when you go to places in Nepal, Pakistan, and you're in these little villages, or I'm working with my Sherpa crew, the times that we are disconnected from the grid, we don't have our smartphones or devices, we become connected in other ways. And I think through society today, we're bombarded with Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is, and we see these other people living these amazing lives, and we think, God, I'm not worthy enough. I'm not like them. I'm not as beautiful. I'm not as hardworking. I'm not in the gym as much. I don't earn as much money. I don't drive that nice. Doesn't matter. If you can cut that fluff away and be you.
How do you now define high performance?
I think high performance is quite an individual thing. In its simplest terms, I would say high performance is where an expected outcome is exceeded. And that could be in the individual, it could be in the organization, it could be within a team. Yeah. And because by the very nature of high performance, it's not a level that you can constantly attain, because I think you end up with burnout. Whereas every now and then you would find that you're operating at a certain level, and high performance for me is where all of a sudden you can peak. Now you've got to be careful with a peak, because what happens after a peak?
A crash.
There's potentially a crash. Yeah. But yeah, you're gonna attain something which is perhaps beyond expectation.
Can we just delve into this a little bit then? Because I think that people look at someone like you, summited Everest more than anybody else. People would look at you and think, what a true high-performing individual. You must be constantly operating at that top level all the time. Like, how aware are you of when you're having a dip, or like you can't go at 100%? We had Joe Wicks, I remember, on the podcast. Remember he said, a flower doesn't bloom all year. There is a period where it has 100% to shrink in.
Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right. I came across Joe Wicks only in lockdown. I remember doing all his workouts for the children. Yeah. It was fantastic, actually. I was a bit bar humbug about him to start with, and in the end, I'm like, wow, he's doing some great stuff.
Really good, yeah.
He's just totally in it. But I think he's right there. I think it's a great analogy. Bradley Wiggins once said that trying to maintain like 70, 80% all the time, because it's impossible to maintain 100%. You just can't do it. There's a reason why footballers have an off season. There's a reason why the rugby's the same, or whatever it is. So I think what I try to do, I try to operate at a level, a constant level, whereby I know that I can peak when I need to. So I live in the Cotswolds. I go running around the fields pretty much every day. And I try to maintain my fitness whereby I never lose fitness. I'm not starting from ground zero. But in the build up to going to Pakistan, or the build up to going to Everest, I know that I can crank it up when I need to be able to perform at a level which is going to be required in that moment. So yeah, Joe's analogy of the flower will bloom for just a few months of the year, and the rest of the time, the flower is still growing, it's still developing, it's still alive. And I think it's the same. I think it's exactly the same. Show me anybody that can operate at 100% the whole time. It just doesn't exist.
And what about mentally then, Kenton? So you described the physical, that resting state where you can raise the pace when you need to. How do you mentally switch off from the pressures of planning an expedition?
For me, switching off is pretty easy, in so much that I invest myself in the family. I've got 2 young children. I've got a beautiful wife, live out in the Cotswolds. And it's only recently I was doing a keynote for an organization, and we were talking about Summit Day on Everest. And Everest, this is going to sound utterly ridiculous. Everest I find relatively straightforward. I'm never going to say I'm complacent about it or take it for granted, because that would be very disrespectful for the dangers that exist on that mountain. But we have a really good understanding of the mountain and how to approach it and what we need to do to get high on the mountain. But Summit Day is stress levels and anxiety levels. Certainly for myself as a professional mountain guide, I'm leading somebody into the death zone. I'm leading somebody into an environment where there is no rescue. And I've been doing that for years. And it was only 2 or 3 years ago, I was doing, as I mentioned, doing a keynote, and I realized the level of stress that I'm under in the build up to that day and then during that day. And it's incredible. It's all consuming. So when I find I come back from an expedition, it's a wave, a tsunami of relief that we're out of the death zone. I've done my job. I've looked after this individual. I've got him or her to the summit and back down again, because let's face it, getting back down is the mandatory part of that expedition. Getting to the top is simply optional. And I get home, and certainly for the first couple of weeks, it's a process of reintegration into Western capitalist society, which I struggle with. But B, it's almost like a stress detox, because the stress levels have been so high in that particular period of time that I think I really struggle with it.
So will you take us into that moment then, where that high stress that you describe is all consuming? Would you describe what that's like, but equally how you process it and deal with it?
So what is it like? It's over a prolonged period of time. And I don't know how unique that is. So I'm a bit of an aviation geek, military aviation. I love it, and I always have done. And I was reading a dialogue from a naval aviator, a Top Gun pilot or something like that. And on approach to landing on a carrier, they are working at maximum capacity. And this particular individual said, if you asked me a question, what's your mother's name? He said, you wouldn't get a response, predominantly because I've not even heard that question, because I'm operating at maximum capacity to try to land that plane on that carrier and not go off the end or crash into it. And it's not quite like that on Everest, but instead of operating in that environment for a matter of 5 minutes or however long it takes to land a plane on a carrier, I'm operating like that for about a week. So the moment that we decide that we're going to leave base camp, so we're looking at weather forecasting, we're looking at what the Sherpa fixing team is doing, putting the rope to the top. I'm looking at the mental and physical state of my clients. I'm looking at what the Sherpa team's doing, looking at conditions on the mountain, and all of a sudden we get the weather forecast in, and beforehand, it's like, okay, this is good to go. We call it the lift. We're going to start the lift, and we're going to move up the mountain to get in position to summit. As soon as you make that decision, I subconsciously, or even consciously, I can feel my stress levels beginning to build up, and the anxiety. You can feel a tightness, and then as you move up the mountain, it begins to get more and more serious, because the margin for error is very, very small. And unlike maybe someone's got a high pressure job in London where we are today, and if you make a mistake in a corporate environment, there's maneuver room. Worst case, maybe you're going to lose your job. But you got to do something pretty bad for that. I don't have to make a big mistake or bad decision. It can be quite a minor mistake, and somebody's potentially going to lose their life, be it maybe the client or one of the Sherpa team, or possibly even myself. So your decision making has got to be absolutely on point. And then by the time you get to the south col of Everest, 8,000 meters above sea level, and let's try and put that in context. So we're in the BT Tower today, and we're pretty high, and we've got this amazing view around us. And I don't know how high we are, a couple of 100 meters maybe. 8,000 meters above sea level. Now, this is where airplanes fly. Next time you get in a plane and you're going on holiday somewhere and captain says, we're cruising altitude and take seatbelt, have a quick look out the window. That's pretty much where we're climbing. There's no rescue. You can't get a helicopter there. You're not going to get a rescue team in to pick you up anytime soon. So everything is on the line. Everything. And you're in what's known as the death zone. That even with supplementary oxygen, the body is dying. And how long you got, you don't know. It's a ticking time bomb. Tick, tock, tick. For how long? Again, you don't know. It's an unknown. It's an uncontrollable. So you're trying to deal with all these uncontrollables and deal with the controllables. And I employ something, I call it binary thinking. I cut everything else out. Because at 8,000 meters, you're stressed, you've got anxiety running, you've got someone's life in your hands. You're the go, no go man. You've got some of these ambitions and dreams. You've got a high performing, to use your term, a high performing Sherpa team around you, looking at you, waiting for that decision. Are we going to go today? Are we going to go tomorrow? Are we going to wait at the coal? What are the oxygen levels? And all the time, even with supplementary oxygen, your brain is being starved of the very thing it needs to operate with, which is O2. And you know what happens. The first thing that gets eroded away when you are starving your brain of oxygen is your capacity for rational thought, your capacity to make decisions, which is irony, really, because you're in the most dangerous environment, arguably, in the world. You've got somebody who's in your charge, and you've got to make rational decisions while starving your brain of oxygen. Are you kidding me? Of course I'm stressed. Now, there might be 5 or 6 Sherpas, paying clients, my own life. We're worried about crowds. We're worried about the weather. We're worried about oxygen levels. And then we've got to step out at night and start moving in an upward direction when every single fiber in your body is saying, go back down. You shouldn't be here. Human beings don't exist at 8,000 meters above sea level. And then you've got to persuade your clients that this is the right thing to do. Yeah, I mean, I'm properly stressed.
What do you do with self-doubt when it creeps in? Because it sounds to me like there's not an awful lot of room for that.
I think there's no room for self-doubt. And a lot of the audience has probably seen, Nims and his 14 peaks. I think it's been on the show.
Yeah.
And Nims is one of these characters that's got so much self-belief and so much confidence. And I'm also a confident guy. I know, and that's my confidence, I think, to a certain extent, comes from the knowledge that I can perform when it really matters. That I've been working on Everest since 2004, but I've been living and working in the mountains since I was 17, 18. There is a real depth of experience that I know I can pull on. David Goggins refers to the cookie jar, and you deposit in that jar. And then when you need to, you can put your hand in the jar, and there is an understanding or a knowledge base within that cookie jar that you can withdraw from. And those deposits come from experience. Now, we were talking about hacks earlier. There is no hack to experience. And when I'm performing at my very best, my confidence is high. And I think certainly for me, when my confidence is high, there is very little self-doubt. Yeah, the demons might be chipping away at you. They might be trying to find a chink in your armor to try to wheedle their way in and to manifest themselves in an ugly manner, to try to derail the mindset which is required for high performance, for confidence, whatever you want to call it, that bulletproof mindset that we all try to achieve. But the negativity that we can generate within ourselves can be very destructive. And the way that I really focus is, partly binary thinking, cut away the fluff. I'm a firm believer that really critical decisions have to be based on logic and not emotion. At the same time, when I start to struggle with that philosophy, I then think of the children, which is emotional thinking. But I use it in a positive way whereby I dispel the demons by telling myself that if I let emotions seep in, I'm potentially going to make a poor decision, not a decision based on logic. And by doing so, it's going to sound quite dramatic, I might die. So I play out a scenario of what does that look like, or what would that look like at home? And by doing so, it keeps me very focused, and it allows me to dispel the demons or the the negative mindsets that may be eroding.
So what you go
confidence.
through almost like a role play of your wife
Exactly
and your children
that. You know, it's vision.
dealing with the news that you've died on the mountain.
Exactly.
Right.
It's generating a vision, is using, trying to play a scenario, in my head of what would that look like? And it's obviously pretty ugly scenario, but I use it in a positive way to enable me to dispel the emotion, to put down the demons, and to keep my thinking.
Can you explain
logical.
how you do that? Because like most people listening to this would be like, well, the one place you don't want to do is allow yourself to imagine your children being told your dad's died on the side of a mountain. So how does playing that out then allow you the clarity of thought, the ability to make the right decision?
Very simply, because it's a scenario that I would never want to play out for real. And by doing so, it fortifies me in a way whereby I am never going to let that happen. What do I need to do to inhibit that?
Have you ever thought it will?
There's been moments that I thought, oh, this is great. Not working on Everest, but on other mountains.
Yeah.
I mean, before becoming a professional mountain guide, I was, I climbed for fun. I was once heralded as one of the best high altitude climbers globally. Whether that's an accolade that was right or wrong, it's neither here nor there. But we were operating at quite a high level, and there were scenarios at times you think, ooh, we may have overstepped the mark here. This is actually going in the wrong direction. Or you're ice climbing, or you're mixed climbing in Scotland, and the weather's horrendous, and everything is reliant on a pick placement. The tiny weeny pick on your ice axe and is wobbling in a placement. You think, my God, if that pops, this is going to get really ugly really quickly. So there've been scenarios that have been less than ideal, but I don't think you ever get in as, you certainly don't start on a journey thinking you're not going to come back. No, it's not as if I'm on some special forces mission where the odds are stacked against you and things like that. We're very careful with our preparation and planning, and we try to mitigate risk as best we can. But
can I bring you back to the metaphor you used earlier about the pilot landing a plane on a moving target? And that's an area of aviation that's really fascinating, because they've had to learn about how people can give feedback to the captain of that plane, where he can embrace it, listen to it, and therefore make a change to their course. So that originated in aviation law after a couple of crashes where people almost got that tunnel vision and couldn't hear it. Now, you described when you're on the mountain and your capacity to think rationally is being impaired by the environment, but you've got high-performing Sherpas around you. So I'm interested of, how do you get feedback from them? How do you create space that they could say to you, Kenton, we need to reconsider this, or we are in a precarious position, and you don't let ego or your desire to get to the top interfere with that?
So I think, it is a tricky one, because the Sherpa culture is definitely one of sort of deferment.
Yeah.
It's not very often you would get a Sherpa say, actually, this is wrong. And it's similar to the culture, I think, with the Air Korea or Korean Air. Now, there's lots of case studies on the culture in Korea. So, Air Korea, the audience probably know this, but they were experiencing a lot of crashes. I forget who the psychologist was that went in and worked out that nobody wanted to overrule the captain of the plane. And it's a little bit like that in Sherpa culture, i.e. they do defer to, I don't mean in a derogatory way, the Western guide.
Yeah.
It's changing a little bit with the likes of NIMS and LACPA from 8K and the different other different companies. But what we try to generate, and it's taken years to get to this situation. What we try to generate within the Sherpa team is that we are all equals, and people listen to that will probably say, well, but there's always got to be a leader. There's got to be, and to a certain extent, yes, but at the same time, by generating a team that is all on an equal basis. And some of my Sherpas have summited more times than me. Dorji, my number one Sherpa, Dorji Geljan. He's 10 years younger than me. He's got 20 summits to his name. And the guy is unbelievable. He's got so much experience on that mountain. He may not have the technical know-how of hard climbing like perhaps I've mastered over many, many years. But he's a powerhouse. He has a really good understanding about the small things that set Sherpa teams apart, because they're from a different religion. English isn't their first language. They're different culture. And he really understands the nuances. And we try to build this team whereby we are all on an equal standing. There is no blame. We do that we did that, or have done that over many, many years I really invested myself in what's important to the team. Now, I spent time in their houses. I've got to know their families. I've got to know the children. I've laughed with them. I've cried with them. We've had success together. We've had tragedy together. And I've earned their respect over many, many years. I used to carry big loads, akin to the Sherpa loads, because the Sherpas carry way more than the average client, like way more, 10 times the amount. And by investing yourself with the team, living with them, breathing with them, you do sort of earn their respect. And it's trust. I trust them and they trust me. And they feel comfortable that if they're uncomfortable about something, they can just put their hand up and say, you know what? I don't think we're doing the right thing. Or have we considered doing this? Or maybe we should wait a day. Or I don't think that weather window is quite what you think it is. Let's sit down and discuss this.
So will you give us an example then, Kenton, where you've been in that death zone, or maybe just before you made that decision to go in there, where one of them have come to you and challenged a plan of action that you've had, that you have then created space to listen to and change your plans?
So generally, I mean, it's normally Dorji. So he becomes like the team spokesman. And there's, for better or for worse, there's normally a little bit of a disconnect between so where the Sherpas would live and hang out, and where, say, I would and the client. And the Sherpas would normally congregate this is at Camp 2. So we are halfway up the mountain. We're at 6,400 meters. Excuse me. And the Sherpas would generally hang out in the kitchen tent. They would eat and hang out and socialize in the kitchen tent, whereby myself and the client, we've got a mess tent. So there's this disconnect, which immediately creates a barrier that needs to be broken down. So I find myself spending quite a lot of time between these two venues. I spend a lot of time in the cook tent, just hanging there, listening to what they're saying. I mean, a lot of it is in Nepalese. I don't speak Nepalese, but then there's English conversations going on as well. And the dialogue would normally occur in the cook tent, where the Sherpas feel feeling really comfortable. So they're amongst their colleagues and their friends, and the cooks in there, the cook boys are in there, and it's a comfortable environment. And generally, it'd be Dorji would simply sidle up next to me, and we could be talking about anything, and then he would just slowly, and I think this is indicative about what an amazing man Dorji is. He would just then slowly slip into conversation that there is a general vibe that they're not comfortable about something. And it could be, the loads which need to be carried up, or perhaps they're tired because they work so hard. They work so hard on the mountain, and they are human beings like you and I. And if we try to emulate what they do on the mountain, physically we'll be crushed, let alone where our mental state would be. So let me give you an example. We would climb from Camp 2 on Everest to the South Col, Camp 4, over 2 days. So if we're all climbing Everest, we'd be using oxygen at maybe a 3 to 4 litre a minute flow rate. We'll be carrying, a relatively light load. And we'll take 2 days to get there. We stop halfway up at Camp 3 and rest and recover, and then next day go again. And we would use maybe 3-4 bottles of oxygen to do that. A Sherpa would go from Camp 2 to Camp 4 carrying 4-5 litres of oxygen. So that's like about 4.5 kilos per bottle. So they're carrying 15-20 kilos on the back. They would do it without oxygen. They would leave early in the morning. When I say early, like 1 o'clock in the morning, climb a good deal through the night, get to the South Col, deposit their load, come back down again to Camp 2, all in one day, and then be back down by a late lunch. They would rest one day and then do it again. And they're doing it without oxygen. It's incredible. It's a unheralded feat of human endurance. I mean, these guys are simply incredible.
And they are uncelebrated or under-celebrated.
Genuinely, yeah, they're certainly under-celebrated. We're beginning to see, NIMS is doing some great work to because NIMS isn't a Sherpa.
Yeah.
People think he is, but he's not. He's from the lowlands, which makes his achievements and his endurance achievements even more incredible. But he's doing some great work celebrating the hard behind-the-scenes work that the Sherpas do. So these guys are doing like big carries like that. And then there is often an expectation that they are physically bulletproof and Sherpas don't get tired. But they do. But culturally, they don't want to let anybody down. So generally there's they will try to hide any physical tiredness that they might have. Whereas we try to generate a culture of openness. And Georgie was saying this year, Kenton die. So die is like a colloquial word for his brother. It's a term of endearment. Kenton die, or KC. It's KC die. Some of the Sherpas are a bit tired. They're not a bit tired. They're exhausted. They're a bit tired. Maybe tomorrow we rest. And you're like, oh, okay. And it's not. He's asking the question. Is in many ways it's a rhetorical question. He's actually telling me that tomorrow they are going to rest, but he's doing it in a way whereby he's presenting it in a very grown-up way, something that we would expect a coach and you sat there, and I know him well enough to know that he's not asking me a question of can they rest tomorrow. He's telling me that they need to rest. And our relationship is deep enough that I understand that. I know what he's trying to tell me. It's not what he's telling me, it's what he's not telling me. So you go, I think that's a good idea, Dorji. I think maybe tomorrow the Sherpa rest. What do you think? And you look at Ming Dorji. Ming Dorji, what do you think tomorrow? You think we're going to rest tomorrow? You go, yeah, I think rest is a good idea tomorrow. So tonight we drink Chang, which is their local home brew. Now, they don't have Chang on the mountain, but tonight we drink Chang. And they all start laughing and joking. Oh, yeah, we drink Chang tonight, but we don't have any Chang. And it's allowing Dorji and the others the space in a very comfortable environment to have that dialogue, knowing that, if I do disagree, if we do disagree, no one's going to be fired, no one's going to be sacked. It's the openness that's required in a situation that actually is very, very serious. Because the last thing I want is one of my top Sherpas keeling over because they're overworked or we're overextended or they're exhausted. I want that team out 100% when it really matters, in case the unthinkable happens. Because if the unthinkable happens, and for whatever reason we have an issue at 8,000 meters or higher, that team needs to be on point to excavators is the wrong word, to extractors from that situation.
Mm.
Yeah. And there's, they can't be tired. I can't be tired. We need the capacity, both mentally and physically, to deal with that situation. Because we can't call 111 and get a helicopter in like you can on the Matterhorn or on Mont Blanc or almost anywhere else. Because if you just think about it for a moment, what environment on the planet does not have some form of rescue? Maybe even at the bottom of the ocean. But even then, you can get like another submersible down there. I mean, it might take a while. You know, the best you can hope for at 8,000 meters on Everest is, you know, maybe another Sherpa team's going to come up from Camp 2 and try and get you out of there. You're not. The highest ever helicopter rescue is 7,000. I think it's 7,800 meters above sea level on a long line, and the conditions need to be perfect.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating environment to work in. You know, I love it. I mean, I love the physicality, but I love the mental side as well. And I love dealing with different cultures and my Sherpas.
What I really like about that is that we have a lot of people, I think, still that feel to be a leader, you have to make all the big decisions yourself. You can't possibly be vulnerable. You need to tell everyone the direction you're going because otherwise it leads to doubt. And they're only dealing with, you know, a decision in the city or a decision in the staff room at school or in their business. Whereas, you know, you are literally dealing with life and death. And that story you've just told us and what you just shared there is a reminder. I think the key thing, which is personal relationships, is what gets you through in those moments, you know, possibly as much as, even if not more than, your skills and your knowledge and your ability. If you can't connect with those people on the mountain, then you die. You talked about the unthinkable. When you have been around the unthinkable happening, you know, thank goodness not to you, but it has happened to other people. And there is a story of you performing CPR on someone for 2 hours on the mountain and still that person died. I'm just interested what that horrendous experience would have done for you, and whether after that there was any resistance from you forever going back on the mountain.
I don't think there was any resistance to going back. So the story was, we came across, I say we, it was Dorji and myself, and we came across a stranded climber, for want of a better word, at Camp 4 on Lhotse. So Lhotse is a neighboring peak, fourth highest mountain in the world, neighboring peak to Everest. And this was back in 2013. And essentially, Mr. Lee, who's a Taiwanese climber, he climbed Lhotse, he's come down, and I don't quite know the ins and outs, but he was suffering from high altitude pulmonary and cerebral edema. So swelling on the brain, fluid on the lungs. He's in a really bad state. And his team didn't have the infrastructure in place to look after him. And then they hid the situation from the rest of base camp because they're trying to sort it out themselves. And anyway, he was essentially left. And we came across him at the high camp. And the first thing I knew about it is one of the doctors at base camp. So there's something called the HRA, the Himalayan Rescue Association. It's a non-profit. And they put doctors in at base camp to look after the clients and people like me, but also the Sherpas. And we get a call over the radio. And the doctor, Rachel, I think her name was, can you just have a look in one of the tents? You know, we're getting reports that there's a climber that needs some help. And so we're like, well, Rachel, there's no one else here. It's just Dorji and myself. She goes, just go and have a look in some of the tents, because the tents are often left up. So we're like, okay, well, we just climbed Everest and we just climbed Nuptse the day before. This is the year that I did the trilogy of climbing these 3 peaks. So, you know, I'm physically knackered. Dorji is tired. I don't think Dorji ever gets knackered, but he's tired. So we look in the tents and there's no one there. And there's 2 tents about 50 yards beneath us. And I know 50 yards isn't very much, but at 8,000 meters, it feels, you know, it could be like 20 miles away. And I look at Dorji and Dorji looks at me. I'm like, okay, scissors, paper, stone. Let's see who goes down there. I lose. I go down. Jesus. Yeah. So I go down there, open up one of the tents, and then there's this Taiwanese guy in there. I'm like, Jesus. Okay, Rachel, there's somebody here. And
was he still coherent at this stage?
no, he was unconscious at this stage, but he's breathing. He's alive. The tent's a disaster zone. There's vomit in there, and it's like his down suit's ripped open. There's a down everywhere. And it's just a really ugly situation. So as we'll go in there, get on the radio, and Rachel was brilliant. She was helping me through the whole thing. And then a couple of other climbers turned up. One was they're both Australian, and they were both climbing Lhotse without oxygen. And one of them was, I don't know if it was a doctor or a paramedic, But he was able to assist me injecting Mr. Lee with dexamethasone, which is a steroid-based drug. And this had quite a profound effect on him. And he regains consciousness. He's trying to talk to me. He's relatively coherent. He can squeeze my hand. He's responding to various tests we're doing on him. But it's now night, and there's no way we can extract him at night time. And I stay up with him throughout the night. I've said to Dorji, there's no need for you to be involved with this. Go back to our tent, get a good night's sleep. We're potentially not going to need your strength tomorrow. So go back to the tent, get a good night's sleep. I'll deal with this for now. And then at some stage, I've climbed these 2 other mountains over like 3 or 4 days. I'm physically exhausted. I'm with Mr. Lee throughout the night. I'm setting an alarm, and I'm waking up every 20 minutes or so to check on him. But at some stage, I drift off, and during the night, and I wake up, and he's not breathing. So, Christ, I've kind of certain degree of responsibility here. I've let him down. He's not breathing, and then tried to call Rachel on the radio, but I forget what time it is. It's 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, whatever. It was a long time ago. Can't really remember. And I'm going into a certain extent into panic mode a little bit, trying to get Rachel on the radio. But not only have I fallen asleep, but I've left the radio out, and the batteries have got cold, so I can't get Rachel. She's probably in bed anyway. But the HRA there's always somebody on the end of the radio. But I kind of know what I need to do. What's Rachel going to tell me? Sticking with more Dex? Well, there's only so much Dex the body can take. And I revert back to being a Boy Scout aged 12, 13 on a first aid course. And if somebody's not breathing and you can't detect a heartbeat, well, you do CPR. Now, admittedly, I don't know how long he's been not breathing for, but I feel the compulsion to try something. And I revert back, I'm 12. And, was it Resusciani or something that they were called? And those rubber doll things. I've never done it for real. And, it's a horrible situation. It's pitch black. It's bloody freezing. And I'm like, okay, let's do CPR. So I start doing CPR. And I don't know if you've ever done it. It's quite exhausting. It's much harder than you think it's going to be. And I don't know how long I need to do it for. Because my first aid training was you do CPR until somebody is more qualified than you comes along and says you can stop or you continue or whatever. But there is nobody coming along. We're at 8,000 meters on Mount Lhotse or 7,800 or wherever we are. So I do it for as long as I can. And then I stop. And I think, Christ, he's dead. I think, no, he can't be dead. This is on my watch. I can't let him down. So you get back to it. And it was maybe, hour and a half, couple of hours. And every time I'd stop, I think you can't stop. Because you stop, he's going to die. So you've got to try something. And then finally I get a warm up the batteries. I actually put them down my underpants. I think, okay, how can I? So I got like 8 AA batteries down or the battery pack, in my down suit, not quite down my underpants, trying to warm it up. Batteries comes alive. I get Rachel, and it's like, okay, well, Rachel, what do I do? And she's like, okay, what's the situation? What are its stats? And so I explain all that, and she's like, well, you got to call it. What do you mean I got to call it? Like, well, and then if you remember watching ER and things like this, and then you got to, the guy is kind of dead. And I'm struggling with all of this. And I kind of just remember sitting back, and it's just about dawn now, perhaps a little bit later. And then there's a crunch, crunch, crunch outside. You can hear crampons in the snow. And I don't know if it's somebody coming up or coming down. And then the zipper zips open. And it's Dorji. Dorji's head comes into this tent, and I'm devastated. And he looks at me and says, so he's been listening on the radio. He's like, so what do we do? And Dorji, man, this isn't why we do these things. Really tired. Quite. And he looks at me and just says, he's dead. There's nothing you can do. And I just look at this guy, and he's literally, his head is in my lap. Oh, sorry about that. This is like 10 years on, I still struggle with this. And Dorji just says, we got to climb. Oh, Dorji, we got to climb. Look at it, there's this guy. I didn't even know his name at the time. There's this guy literally in my lap. I can't climb. And he just looks at me and goes, I've always wanted to climb Lhotse. We should climb. And we're not climbing for him. We're climbing for me. And he knows me so well. Oh, really sorry about this. He knows me so well, and he knows exactly how to pull the right strings.
Yeah.
And I think that's so telling of when you put together a team that really works, you know exactly what everybody needs on that team in a time of crisis. Whether they need to find that extra gear, or whether in that scenario, whether in that moment, that individual, I don't think it is, but let's call it vulnerability, what he or she needs to get over that. And Dorji just hit all the right notes. And I think it's partly indicative of what an amazing man he is, but also the culture that over years, all of us have put together in that situation. And I was conflicted. I put on my crampons and I left Mr. Lee in that tent, and we climbed. And it's been very easy for somebody out there to say, well, perhaps you should have done this or should have done that. But for me in that moment, or for us in that moment, I mean, Mr. Lee was dead. There's nothing we could have done anymore to try to look after him. And we climbed. And what's the phrase? You fall off a horse, first thing you got to do is get back on it. And I think it was perfect. I remember coming back down, we climbed Lhotse, somebody at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we get caught in a storm on the way down. We climbed these 3 peaks, and heralded as quite a big thing in the climbing world at the time. And we come down in a storm, and I'm like, oh Christ, what else can be thrown at us? And we get back down to the high camp, and Dorji's busy packing various things up. And I just said to him, I just need a few minutes.
Yeah.
And went back into the tent with Mr. Lee and just sort of sat there. And just try to deal internally with what had happened overnight. And then, a Sherpa team was coming up to try to initiate a rescue. I mean, they're obviously too late by probably a couple of days. And I just remember zipping Mr. Lee into a sleeping bag, and closing the tent door on him and walking away. His body was recovered 2 days later, I think, by the Sherpa team, and his family contacted me a little while afterwards.
I mean, it's incredible stories, and thank you for sharing it. But it's also a reminder of a phrase that we've used in other interviews on this series around the memento mori, the reminder of our own mortality, and you've seen it in the most visceral, real sense of it. So I'm interested in, how did you process Mr. Lee's death and justify continuing to scale Everest, continuing to put yourself into those death zones?
I don't think I have processed what happened. I'm still quite bitter with the logistical team that was looking after him. I've never spoken to them about it. I've got to know them relatively well since. I've never spoken to them about it, which perhaps I should. I
wonder why you haven't. You strike me as the kind of person that would go straight in and go, listen, the next person in that position doesn't die, and here's how they don't die.
And they shouldn't die. And hey, it's that particular logistical outfit. I mean, they've got a lot better now, but they had an awful track record back then. And yeah, maybe there was a duty that I should have done to try to put things in place that sort of thing, because it was avoidable. It was totally avoidable. but I don't think I have process. I'm really bad at putting things like that into a closet and closing the door. And I've experienced, a lot of friends of mine have died in the mountains or rock climbing or whatever it is that they're doing. And I don't think I've ever fully processed things. And I think partly it's the generation that I'm from. I think it's partly, this is going to sound rubbish, I think it's partly because I'm a guy, and there is this sort of stigma around that you don't show weakness, and you just deal with things. But we all know that that's wrong these days. And over the last few years, I have been investing time in myself, which I think is such an important thing to do. If a friend comes up to you and says, hey, I need help with something, I'm trying to process this, or I'm going through a divorce, or my dad's just died, or I've done this, or whatever it is, you help that individual. You maybe sit down with them, you spend time with them, you try to get them through the trauma of whatever trauma it is that they're experiencing, and try to put them in a better place. Well, why wouldn't we do that to ourselves? Now, I know people are, and the culture that we're in today is much better, but we'd invest time in others. Why don't we invest more time in ourselves? And I'm beginning to do that and understand that these things do need closure, and they do need to be an open dialogue with people. And my wife's fantastic for doing this.
So would you have shared that story with your wife?
Oh God, yeah.
So
yeah.
So then how does she react when you then say, I'm now off again to Everest?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting one, isn't it? Because it's people that you leave behind. And I don't know the stress and anxiety. I mean, I was talking about the stress and anxiety of Summit Day on Everest. But what is the stress and anxiety of those that don't come? That those that aren't there in the moment, going through the processes of the decision making, and Jazz doesn't know what the weather is. She doesn't know what the how the clients are, or the oxygen levels and things like this. All she sees, for better or for worse, these days, we've all got trackers and things like that, and you can track you up the mountain and all these things. She knows what it's entailed. I mean, she's heard a story about Mr. Lee, or the Sherpa that I pulled off the fixed lines, who he got hit by a rock and half his head fell off, and and she knows the attrition rate with my friends, and but I don't know what she goes through. I mean, we talk about it sometimes, and I mean, there's a couple of sort of anecdotal stories that perhaps shows you a little bit about what she goes through, and what the children go through. The children are now 9 and 11. They have an understanding about what daddy does, and they have an understanding about the dangers. Whereas when they're younger, daddy's gone climbing mountains, and that's really jolly good fun. And I was on K2 last year in Pakistan, a much harder mountain to climb. And I'm there with a client, and we were on Summit Day, and my tracker glitched. And instead of going up, all of a sudden, it's moved significantly in a downhill direction.
Oh.
And Jazz is, oh Christ,
He's fallen.
He's fallen. The only way you can move that far in that short space of time is he's fallen. And it's one of those amazing things, isn't it? I used to go to the Himalayas and be off radar for 6 weeks. And that old age adage of no news is good news. Mm. Well, unfortunately today, I'm getting my phone out. We are all connected all the time. And there is an expectation that we can check in whenever we want. But sometimes, for whatever reason, we can't. The battery dies, or there's no signal, or we've forgotten, or we've mislaid our phone or device. But all of a sudden, there's this tracker now that I use, and Jazz is thinking, Christ, he's fallen. What can I do? What happened? What happened? Luckily, she's got the depth of experience, and she's experienced many ascents of Everest, and K2's new, but she checks one or two of the other trackers of the party, and everybody else is moving in upward direction. So she's like, okay, let's not panic just yet. People are still moving up. So, but that's because she's educated in what I do. But for that moment, she's like, Christ, and what's running through her mind? Well, another time, it's actually just after Mr. Lee. So I climbed these mountains, these 3 mountains. I'm away from base camp for about a week. And I made a slip with my vocabulary. I said to Jazz over the telephone, "Oh, sweetheart, I'm going to, I leave base camp tomorrow. We're off to climb, Nuptse, Everest, Lhotse, and I'll be gone for a few days." Using the terminology "few" in a fairly ambiguous. A week later, I'm still not back. And I've been dealing with Mr. Lee, and there's been a couple of text messages from the sat phone, because I carry a sat phone. But my logistical provider back then, a really colourful character called Henry Todd, is concerned. And he knows Jazz. Henry's in his 70s now. And he knows Jazz. So he decides he's going to ring up Jazz and just say, everything is okay. Because even back in 2013, the information highway is alive and kicking, and a word's going to get out that, this guy's dead and I'm involved, and it's going to be on Twitter or whatever it is pretty quickly. And you can get information through third-party sources, which perhaps isn't substantiated. And he's like, Christ, I got to let Jazz know that everything is actually okay. So he rings her up on a sat phone. But a sat phone's got a very specific number, plus 881. I think a sat phone number is. I think it's 881. But it's not my sat phone. Somebody else's sat phone. So why is somebody else ringing her up on an unknown sat phone number? Well, why do you get in contact when no news is good news?
Yeah.
Well, you only get in contact for one reason. When something bad has happened. Actually, it's just Henry being kind. But Henry has the foresight of knowing that Jazz is going to panic. And apparently, she picks up the phone, heart palpitations, everything else, and Henry just blurts out, "He's absolutely fine," before she can say anything. Just to, and there's two, anecdotal stories there about the danger of connectivity that we have that is remote and virtual. I mean, who was it? Johan. I forget what his book was called. The opposite of addiction is connection. Johan. Okay, anyway, his name eludes me. And I think he's absolutely right. We feel that we are connected in this day and age, but actually we are less connected than we ever have been, despite the fact that I can sit here and I could be talking to my wife virtually. But yeah, and it's one of those fascinating things about how this technology can inhibit sometimes high performance. You're wearing a whoop. Yeah. So it gives you all the data you need to generate high performance. It'll give you sleep. It will give you training zones and all sorts of things. I mean, it's a brilliant technological aid to performance. Yeah. At the same time, we can get lost in data. We can get lost by that lack of connectiveness, which I believe deep down we need as a species, as a society. We're going off on tangents now, but
this is a good tangent for high performance.
Yeah, I don't think it is a tangent. I think when we talk about this connectivity, so you talk about Jazz and the children, there'll be people listening to this, Kenton, though, that think that what you're doing carries a degree of selfishness. That when you hear those anecdotes about the stress that Jazz goes through of receiving the calls, so how do you square that away with being a loving father and a husband, and yet still having this need to go and scale the mountains?
So you're 100% right. Climbing is one of the most arbitrary, selfish, ridiculous things, I think, in existence. Because generally, you're never going to get rich. You're never going to get famous. And in many ways, it's almost a perfect sport because of that. So you do it, or I do it at least, for much more holistic, organic, meaningful ways, because it means something to me. And okay, I've summited Everest 16 times and all this, but that's actually, it's completely irrelevant. I actually think the mountains, records don't belong on mountains, other than who made the first ascent, or maybe the first ascent of a new route on a mountain. Everything else is just arbitrary. It really is. Because anyway, and it is very selfish, very, very selfish. Now, I could try to parry that by saying it is my job. I pay the mortgage through climbing big mountains. But I could be a stockbroker or a lawyer or a whatever. I could choose any sort of avenue. And does it need justification? Well, maybe to the outsider it does, but to us as a cohesive family unit, it doesn't. And the reason I think it doesn't is to be the best husband or father that I can be. There needs to be a level of contentment. And I find my contentment is aided by time spent in the mountains, whether that's for work or whether that's for play. And it could be skiing, it could be walking, it could be rock climbing or whatever it is. And if you remove that, I definitely get jittery. And Jazz, Jazz can see it. And she said a number of times she said to me, you know what? I think you need to book a flight, go and contact some of your friends out in the Alps and just sod off and go climbing. Come and see me in a week's time because you're getting unpleasant. The children don't like you right now. And I think you're being really, really mean. So go on, right off and come back in a week's time. And because she's so astute, she knows what, and I will come back reset, much more pleasant. And I mean, Alaveras wrote a book called Feeding the Rat. And it's about Mo Antoine. It was Mo Antoine's biography, a climber who died in the 80s, I think. And inside us, and it doesn't matter. It could be climbing, it could be sport, it could be anything. It could be work, it could be. And inside us, we have a rat, and that rat needs sustenance. And if you starve the rat, or whatever sustenance he or she needs, they start gnawing away at your insides. And that rat, in my rat, needs time in the mountains. And when he's content, he will quite happily curl up and do whatever rats do when they're not gnawing away. And I think it's so true. I think we all have a rat of some description, and we all need that selfish time, that self-investment that we were talking about earlier, that time to ourselves. And I want to spend time with the family. I want to be playing French cricket or football in the garden with my son and my daughter, or taking her up to the hockey pitch and hitting hockey balls around. Yet at the same time, I need that me time because I am a human being as well. And I'm developing and I'm growing and I'm learning all the time. And we need to invest in the me sometimes as much as we invest in other people. And we forget that sometimes.
Right at the beginning, you spoke about coming back and almost having to decompress from mountain life and having to reacclimatize to the Western world. Before we move on to our quickfire questions at the end, I would love you to share with us any lessons or learnings or the biggest thing that we can take away from this conversation when it comes to the mistakes we're making in this Western world. Because what we haven't seen, and all the people listening on their smartphones right now whilst on the tube or on the bus to work, are totally immersed in this Western world. Many people listen to this because they want to be entrepreneurial and they want to make their mark and they want to get rich. And what is the biggest mistake? What's the biggest trap that we're all falling into that you've almost been shown the light when it comes to the other world that you've operated in?
I think I'm really lucky. I travel a lot, and I travel to places in South America, like Pakistan, India. I've seen a whole host of things. And whenever I come back to the UK or wherever it may be, I used to live in France. I come back to France, I really worry about the society that we belong to. The capitalist society that we are indoctrinated to believe is so amazing and something that we should all be part of. And it's instilled from us from a really early age. And I'm not in complete agreement that the capitalist society is the best society. Gordon Gekko, greed is good. Really?
Yeah.
Well, how much do we need? I mean, I'm looking out at London today, and we can see all the cranes up, and I can see buildings as far as I see, and people are going about the business. And you mentioned just a minute ago in the question, people are listening to this on their smartphones, or they've got earbuds in on the bus or on the What happened to connectedness? And when you go to places in Nepal or Pakistan and you're in these little villages, or I'm working with my Sherpa crew, the times that we are disconnected from the grid, we don't have our smartphones or devices, we become connected in other ways. And all of a sudden there's a community. There's a collective, because the capitalist society is all about the individual. And really, if you go back, not even that far, the human species is tribal. And a tribe is a collection of individuals that is much more powerful than the individual, because a tribe needs everybody working together to exist. Is it the Kalahari, the tribe that's in the Kalahari Desert? They work 16 hours a week, I think it is. It's in the book, The Opposite of Addiction is Connection. I forget what the book's called. And it's talking about the power of connectedness. And if somebody's not pulling their 16 hours, they're kicked out of the tribe. And they're not going to exist for very long, because everybody's got to pull their weight. And that's for the collective good. And you see that in some of these, air quotes, developing cultures, developing nations. But honestly, and we saw it a little bit in lockdown. We saw the positiveness of communities coming together and pulling as one. We're all in it together. But we're short-sighted individuals, and we're constantly thinking about one-upmanship or getting one over your neighbor or whatever it is. Keeping up with the Joneses, the rat race that is
the environment's the
Western
biggest
society.
example. We're putting everything in front of the environment,
Oh,
and
my
there will be no
goodness.
mountains to climb for the next generation.
Yeah, well, there's going to be no planet left if we continue. And that's such a good analogy.
It's the biggest madness of all, isn't it?
It's-
Literally, there will be no planet, yet you still want to build a
And you see the
coal-powered-
manifestos of our governments going,
Yeah.
oh yeah, we're going to address this. Yeah. And it's like such short-term
Nothing less is
madness.
more. Yeah, it's a madness, yeah.
Because there's going to be nothing left. And if there's anything that I learned, it's the power of community, the power of the collective, having the right culture. And I do really struggle. I come back. So let me just give you a very quick anecdotal analogy. I forget where I'd been, Pakistan or somewhere. And I built a house out in the Cotswolds, or we built a house 4 or 5 years ago. And I came back. I forget where I'd been, Pakistan. So I came back from Pakistan, and the walls are just going up. And I'm walking around this house. It's a relatively large house, big footprint. This is the world's biggest bungalow. I'm walking around this thing, and I'm absolutely horrified by what we're doing. I said to Jazz, are you kidding me? The amount of money we're investing in this? In Pakistan, there'd be like 10 families living here. And we got this plot of land in this house all to ourselves. There's only 4 of us. This is vulgar. This is disgusting. I was back the following week, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Because, we are, myself included, we are so short-sighted sometimes. And of course, we built the house and everything else. And, I come back and I look at it sometimes. And I came back from Nepal this year. I'm looking at it, I was thinking, Christ. Now, I'm part of the problem. Now, perhaps I have that realization that I am part of the problem. But
it's also a reminder that we have to have cognitive diversity. We have to have different outlooks. We have to open our horizons. Because if you just existed, if you never left, you'd never feel like that. If you
100%.
There,
Yeah, and I learned from quite an early age. Yeah, I was in Pakistan. I was 19 years old, my first expedition. We climbed this mountain, did a first ascent, drop off the wrong side of the mountain for various reasons. And we're walking across a meadow, and this young boy, well, probably the same age as me at the time, he was 17, 18, he was a goat herder. He comes running up, he's shouting, screaming at us. I mean, oh my God, we're going to get, this is really bad. And it's quite the opposite. He hadn't seen a human being for weeks. He's up there on his own. And he doesn't speak a word of English. I don't speak Urdu. And there's 3 of us. And he invites us into his goat herding shed thing, yurt, whatever it was. He's just there on his own. And we spent the night there. And he shared what little he had. He shared everything with us. He cooked his dinner. We run out of gas. We ran out of food on this climb. And this generosity that he was showing us. And, I didn't grow up in poverty, but my dad was unemployed through a lot of my teenage years. So I understood a little bit about hardship, but I still had a roof on my head. We had running water. We had food on the table. And there's this guy with, this kid with almost nothing. And he's sharing everything.
Yeah.
And I was mesmerized by this. And it was a light bulb moment that everything that I had understood or been taught up to that point was arguably a fabrication. And that there was something entirely different. There was a different way of living your life.
Yeah.
And showing generosity to others, which is arguably the most important, most rewarding thing that we can actually do. And it took this young Pakistani boy to educate me on that, despite the fact that I'd been to university and been to a grammar school in High Wycombe and all these amazing things.
Yeah.
No one ever taught me that.
And here you are 30 years later and you still carry the memory of that.
Oh God, yeah. I often wonder what happened to him.
Shepherd, yeah.
Yeah.
He might still be there. He might still be looking
God, I
after
hope
his
not.
flock.
God, it was a hard way of life.
Yeah.
But yeah, he may well
Yeah.
be. Perhaps he's not even alive. I don't know. But that generosity. I mean,
That's
his
a really
goat's
good
curd was
example
awful
of-
though. Got to say, his goat's curd. Oh my goodness. But he shared it with us.
There you go.
That's a really good example of that quote, isn't it? That when the student is ready, the teacher will appear, and
Hmm.
maybe that was the right time for that lesson
Yeah.
for you.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. Yeah, Naltar Valley in North Pakistan. Amazing.
Right.
Quick fire questions. I'm nervous about this.
What are,
Excuse me.
and this is a good one actually for someone
Is it
that
multiple
does what
choice?
you do. No.
Oh, damn.
The 3 non-negotiables that people have to buy into if they're going to allow you to take them up a mountain.
But yeah, I mean, they're all value driven, I think. I mean, honesty's got to be right up there.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time building a trust relationship with my clients before we go to Everest. And it's all about honesty because I need to know, as a mountain guide, there's lots of stuff we can do, but I'm not a mind reader. And if I ask you how are you feeling on a scale of 1 to 10, it's got to be an honest answer because otherwise we can get. So honesty is one. I mean, kindness.
Yep.
I've learned that over the years. I'm still learning that. I'm not as kind as I could be. So there's ever developing. But yeah, honesty, kindness, and I suppose it's linked to honesty, but integrity. I think honesty and integrity are actually subtly different because I think you can be have integrity, but maybe be dishonest. Or maybe it's the other way around. I don't know. But yeah, I think there's, I would say kindness is you can't be kind enough.
No.
Where were you? Where are you? And where are you going?
I'm certainly on a learning journey. Now I spoke about it earlier. I forget whose book it is. It's on about that pathway to mastery, and I'm on a personal journey to understand myself more. It's only something I've been investing in relatively recently. I think I was deluding myself. So where was I? I was very self-absorbed. Where am I? I'm on that path. And where am I going? I don't think I ever get to mastery, but perhaps I'd like to move out of apprenticeship to journeyman. And even by saying that, that's self-absorbed, isn't it? Because that's all about me. But I think you need to understand yourself in order to be able to project that in a meaningful way onto others. I like to be kinder.
Well, it's there. It's there if you want to be kinder.
Oh yeah, I know that. I know that. But it's how you sometimes project that. And in times of when you're stressed, then you quite often, I do anyway, sort of revert back to your default settings. And my default settings aren't always the most holistic or kind sometimes. And I've only learned this through the teachings of my wife, who's a very wise, generous individual. And yeah, we're constantly learning and developing.
Yeah. Talking of which, just breaking away from the quick fire questions for a minute, like I found this obviously a deeply emotional interview. And I see, your tears in your eyes when you talk about your children, tears in your eyes when you talk about the young shepherd who was generous to you, obviously tears in your eyes when you talk about the traumas you faced on the side of the mountain. And this is in the context of you currently being more open about exploring your own emotions and your own feelings. I wonder if we'd have had this conversation 5 or 10 years ago, would the emotions have been as on the surface as they are? Or maybe the work you've done on yourself recently has made you realize the power of your own human emotion and your power of vulnerability, really?
I think the emotion's always been there. It's been one of those, it's one of those things, I get teary very easily. I could be presenting on stage to an organization and get teary talking about, an Everest ascent. It's one of those really strange things that I tear up a lot. I've tried to hide it in the past because it's not what alpha males are meant to do. And I've given up on that years ago.
Yeah.
I don't see any harm in being teary. But behind that, there's a deeper emotion today than there would have been 10 years ago. My understanding of my own connectiveness with my feelings is deeper now than it was. I was winging life even 5 years ago. And it was only, I think, through reading, through listening to podcasts, that I realized I needed to work on myself.
Yeah.
And it's a work in progress. And it always will be. But I'm really glad that I embarked on it. So yeah, I'm a very different individual, much more connected to who I am than I was 5-10 years ago. It would have been a very different interview. But then everybody changes over time. I think even if you two sat here, if it was role reversal, it would have been a very different interview style 5-10 years ago. And it's changed. I'm not saying it's better or worse. It just would have been different. And having that understanding that things can be different and things don't always need to be better, they're just different, is important.
How important is legacy to you?
My own legacy is somewhat irrelevant. That's my self-centeredness coming out again. But I think what's really important is the next generation, my children, or even children perhaps slightly younger than them. We need to educate our ability to affect change is, well, certainly mine. I'm nearly 50. Is now non-existent. Yeah, my generation has wreaked havoc on the planet, society, and all these sorts of things. And if there was going to be any legacy, it's implementing some form of change. And I don't think I can do that. I can't do that. The biggest legacy that my generation can leave is educating the next generation to not be us, and to be more aware of the impact that we have. I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because the biggest impact that I would ever have on this planet is by having children. And that was a conscious decision. And children never asked to get born. So it's our duty to educate them, so that they can navigate their lives on this planet and this society, and hopefully implement change whereby society becomes better, the environment starts to heal, so that there is a life that's not some post-apocalyptic nightmare, which I think we're heading towards. So legacy, Everest will always be there, long after I'm gone, you gone, my children are gone. So legacy is really somewhat meaningless, I think, to me, beyond trying to leave something that the next generation can enjoy.
What advice would you give to a teenage Kenton just starting out?
A teenage Kenton was a very shy, naive, introspective individual who didn't perhaps express who he could have been or wanted to be. And I think this was brought into beyond my teenage years. This was brought into my 20s and my 30s. That inability to be vulnerable, the inability to express emotion, the inability to be connected to others. And I don't think that was my upbringing. It was just kind of who I was and the environment that I was in. Whereas now I look back on it and it's very inhibiting back then. And it shouldn't have been. And if I wanted to express perhaps who I wanted to be more, that was perfectly acceptable, because ultimately nobody cares, really. I was always in fear of failure in the eyes of my peers. I mean, I'm very competitive, destructively so. And not wanting to fail in the eyes of my peers, ultimately they don't care. Really? And it's taken me a long, long, long time to learn that. I used to have a savage jealousy streak that came from that fear of failure and that competitiveness. And jealousy is a hideous human trait. It's nasty. Just be who you want to be.
If you could go back to one moment in your life, what would it be and why?
We've not really talked about it. I had a pretty bad climbing accident a long time ago, 25, 26, 27 years ago, 1996, whenever that was. It was hard.
Broke both your heels.
Broke both my heels. Told you wouldn't walk without a stick. Definitely wouldn't climb. Wouldn't be able to run. And it crushed me. Because the community that I was part of, the climbing community, it's going back to that connection, that connectiveness through a collective. It was everything I stood for. It was my life, and that was taken away, or attempted to taken away by a consultant who crushed me by saying, "You won't climb." And I saw that as taking away. Climbing would take away everything. And then I was in a wheelchair. Learning to walk again with crutches, falling over on parallel bars into the arms of my physio, and all these things. I mean, it was a hideous time. Yeah, at the same time, such a rich time for learning. And it sounds ridiculous. I think if we could go back to that time, with what I know now, I'd learn so much more. And I think some of the hardships that I've endured since then, because I didn't optimize my learning, being given that opportunity, I'd love to go back and experience that whole thing again. I don't regret falling off and smashing myself up. Not one little. I like to think I don't regret anything, other than perhaps I didn't take full opportunity of that learning potential that I had back then, because I could have learned so much more quicker back then rather than learning now. I love the opportunity to go back. Maybe not experience all the pain and the physical pain of falling off and all things like that. But yeah, it's an amazing time being in a wheelchair in London, trying to navigate all of that presents to you. This is in 96. Buses that go down, and disabled access back then was crap. And the ability to learn. I don't think I missed it completely, but I'd love to go back.
And last question, your final message really for people that have listened to this brilliant episode of High Performance. What would you like to leave ringing in their ears, your one final golden rule to living a high performance life?
Single golden rule. I mean, how do you distill high performance and life into a single golden rule? I think ultimately, we've already mentioned it. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter what other people think of you, because we we navigate life, and what we do, it's about what you think of yourself. And to really achieve high performance, you have to believe in yourself. And it doesn't matter if other people believe in you or not, it's what you believe. And I think through society today, we're bombarded with Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is. And we see these other people living these amazing lives, and we think, God, I'm not worthy enough. I'm not like them. I'm not as beautiful. I'm not as hardworking. I'm not in the gym as much. I don't earn as much money. I don't drive that nice. Doesn't matter. If you can cut that fluff away and be you, regardless of what other people think about you. And I suppose the other thing is surround yourself with people that tell you what you need to know.
Yeah. Not
what you want to know or what you want to be told. And that comes back to that self-belief. We live in a society that is very fake. And for the majority of people, it erodes their self-belief. And if you want to be experience high performance, or even good performance, or be working at an optimum level, you've got to believe in yourself, regardless of what others think.
Yeah.
And that is, in this day and age, it's hard. It's hard.
Kenton, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Fascinating conversation. And like the big thing that I've ringing in my ears is personal connection, which we've had, I think, during this conversation, but you've clearly learned to have such deep, strong, powerful connections with people, whether you're on the mountain, whether you're at home with your family. And it's a brilliant reminder for people in this world where we feel more connected than ever, and actually we are more disconnected than ever. So thank you so much, man. That was
it's a pleasure.
Really, really interesting.
Incredible.